So last Sunday, I preached a sermon entitled, This Is Us. And in that sermon, I talked about who we are as a church and how God has established us and what it is that's important to us as a church. Today, I want to take that a step further. And I want to talk about where it is that God is leading us. Specifically, I want to talk about who we are becoming as a church. And I think that's an important it's an important subject to delve into, especially during this season that we're in as a church. And I think it's important really for two main reasons. The first reason is this. Tomorrow evening, we're going to gather as a church family to make one of the most important decisions that we will have made in the 25-year history of our church. We're going to gather together tomorrow evening for a church conference where we're going to vote on whether we should move forward with the next campus renovation program and begin construction on that in January. And so the last couple of weeks, I think it's been important as we prepare for this important decision to talk about who we are and to talk about today who we're becoming and then to simply ask the question as to whether the decision that we make tomorrow evening is in line with God's will for who we're becoming as a body of believers called Christ United Methodist Church. So the first reason why it's important for us to talk about this is simply because we're going to make a big decision tomorrow. The second reason I think it's important for us to talk about who we are and about who we're becoming is that quite frankly, we have been held captive in various degrees of severity because of a global pandemic since March. I mean, I don't think anybody ever imagined that we as a congregation would spend 3 months after this pandemic began, not being able to meet together in person. I know that there are some churches in our country who have still not yet resumed meeting together in person, but I don't think any of us would have ever imagined that we would not meet together in person for a 3-month period of time. And coupled with the fact that I don't think any of us imagined that we would spend 8 months of time, and it's continuing on from this point forward. But I don't think any of us imagined that we'd spend 8 months and counting of having more people worship with us online than in person. So none of us imagined that we would engage in this kind of season for ministry. And so I like to think that COVID-19 has offered us a very unique opportunity to just step back and take a look at who we are from a vantage point that we will never again have. I mean, this is a very, very strategic vantage point that we find ourselves in, and I think we ought to make good use of it because, well, let's face it, I think our church, any organization for that matter, always ought to have a compelling vision that guides them as they move from one day to the next, 1 week to the next, 1 year to the next. And so I believe that this is a very important time for us to just step back and take a look and see where it is that God is leading us, to see what vision for ministry He has placed before us. And we need to embrace that vision because, well, it says in Proverbs 29:18, without a vision, the people will what? Perish. And so it's important for us not only to remind ourselves of who we are, but to talk about who it is that we're becoming. And so this morning, I'm going to spend this sermon talking about who it is that we're becoming as a church. And the scripture that's captured my mind as I've been listening for direction from God in this is a charge that Paul gave to the church in Philippi in the 2nd chapter of his letter to that church. And it begins in verse 12. And this is what he said. He said, "Work hard to show the results of your salvation, obeying God with deep reverence and fear. For God is working in you, giving you the desire and the power to do what pleases Him." Please don't miss that word. God is working in you, giving you the power and the desire to do what pleases Him. Do everything, therefore, without complaining and arguing, so that no one can criticize you. Live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people. And hold firmly to the word of life. Hold firmly to the word of life. And so God has given us a charge. A charge to be a people who shine like lights in the darkness of this world around us. And while we do that, we need to hold firmly to the word of life. We need to hold firmly to our testimony of what Jesus has done for us. And what has Jesus done for us? Well, Jesus lived a life that we could never live. And he died a death that we should have died. And he rose to give us a life that we could never live otherwise. And Jesus alone, he alone is the way to God. He alone is the truth that sets us free. And he alone is the life that shines like a light in this world. And because of that, we have a deep calling to show the results of our salvation with the way in which we live our lives. We have a deep responsibility to show the results of our salvation as a body of believers called Christ United Methodist Church. We must do all that we can to let people know what Jesus has done in our lives and among us in this church. And we can't get bogged down with complaining or bickering or arguing. We can't leave any room for people to criticize us. And if we can live that way, if we can live the kind of lives that he's called us to live, without complaining, without arguing, without leaving room for people to criticize, then our witness will make a difference. And we will shine like light in this world in which we live. And so the sermon today is based on a very simple statement. And that statement is this: our calling as Christians and our job as a church is to be the light of Jesus and push back the darkness in our world and in our culture and in this community in which we've been placed. And so what does that look like for you and me? What does that mean for us? Well, to answer that question, I want to say this to you. I believe with all my being that you don't live where you live by accident. You don't. You don't live in the house you live in by accident, or in the neighborhood that you live in by accident. You're not here this morning or worshiping with us online by accident. I mean, let's face it. It is not going to be a surprise to God what you eat for lunch today or what you do this afternoon. None of that's it's not going to surprise God what you do tomorrow or the next day or the next. None of that's going to be a surprise to God. And so what that means, at least to me, is this: that you and I are placed by God in this world. He has placed you and me where he has placed us so that we will be light bearers. He has placed you in the family that he's placed you in so that you will be a light bearer to those in your family. God has placed you in the neighborhood that you live in so that you will be a light bearer to those who live around you. God's placed you in the friend group that you're a part of so that you will be a light bearer to those in your friend group. God has placed you in relationships very intentionally so that you will be a light bearer to those with whom he's placed you in relationship. He has placed our church in a very strategic place so that we will be a light to those around us. You and I have been placed where God has placed us so that we will be light bearers. He's placed our church in this specific spot in South College Station so that we would be light bearers to those who live in the neighborhoods surrounding our church. Did you know that our very first newsletter, you know what it was called? It was called The Lighthouse. That's a copy of our very first newsletter, published in July of 1995. It was called A Lighthouse because that's what we're called to be. As a church, we're called to be a lighthouse for people who are living in darkness. We're called as a church to be a lighthouse, to point people to Jesus, who is the light, who the darkness will never overcome. That's what we're called to be. And as I think about our church, and as I think about our calling to be that light that pushes back the darkness in the lives of the people who live around our church, I am so clear in my soul that we must, as a congregation, strive with all our being to be a place where everyone is welcome, where everyone is loved, where everyone is challenged to go deeper in their faith in Jesus Christ, and from which every person is sent. That's what we've got to work hard at doing every single day of our existence as a church, to be a place where everyone is welcome, where everyone is loved, where everyone is challenged to go deeper in their relationship with Jesus Christ, and we must strive to be a place from which everyone is sent. And so as I've been listening for direction on where God is leading our church, I've heard a few things from him. I want to share this morning with you 5 different areas that God has given me as ways that our church can push back the darkness in our community and in our neighborhoods and in our world. And each one of these focus points that he's given me addresses a very specific problem that not only our church faces, but every church for that matter. And so the first focus point that he's given me is that I believe that God is leading our church to become grounded in power-giving prayer. Power-giving prayer. And the problem that this focus point addresses is a powerless church. You see, there are a lot of churches, I believe, that and we can succumb to this at times, that focus on providing good programs, that focus on getting people to show up, that focus on encouraging people to have a good time with one another and engage in good fellowship, but miss the power. They can, as Paul wrote in 2 Timothy 3:5, have the appearance of godliness, but lack the power thereof. A lot of churches place their focus on programs and on fellowship and on activity, but in the end, they're a powerless church because they don't pray and they don't recognize that our greatest source of power comes not from programs, but from our knees. It's why Jesus said in Matthew 21:13, he said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer." He didn't say, "My house shall be called a house of preaching." He didn't say, "My house shall be called a house of singing." He didn't say, "My house shall be called a place of endless activity." He said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer." It's why when you see a picture of the first Christian communities in the book of Acts, you see in Acts 1:14 this: they all met together and they were constantly united in prayer. Constantly united in prayer. I spoke last week about the fact that our church is, one of the markers of our church is that we believe in heart-transforming prayer. I believe God is calling us to go deeper. I believe God is calling us not only to be a place that believes in heart-transforming prayer, I believe God is leading us to be a church that believes to the depths of our being in power-giving prayer. So what does that look like? Well, I think it's going to look like a lot of things at some point. But right now, I see 2 primary ways that I believe God is leading us to engage as a congregation in power-giving prayer. One is, I believe God is wanting to grow up a body of people from within our body of believers who are Sunday morning prayers. Yes, we're going to have Sunday morning prayers, always. But I believe that God is wanting to build up a group of people who are called and set aside to be Sunday morning prayers. I told you last week about our church-wide study that we did last fall, and I truly believe that one of the reasons why it was so impactful was because of the people who gathered every Sunday morning before our 8 o'clock worship service and prayed for me and prayed for all that was going to happen in the Sunday morning worship service. I believe that God is growing up a people who will be Sunday morning prayers, who will pray for what happens in our worship services every Sunday morning. This past week, as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of of Charles Haddon Spurgeon. C.H. Spurgeon was perhaps one of the greatest preachers of the 19th century. In fact, he's been considered one of the greatest preachers in history. He would regularly preach to upwards of 10,000 people on a Sunday morning when he preached. And he was considered by some to be the prince of the pulpit in London. And people came from all over really from all over the world to hear him preach. And what's interesting about Spurgeon is that he never took credit for any of the successes that he had through his preaching. He always pointed to the power of prayer as the reason for the effectiveness of his preaching. In fact, one day, and you may have heard this story, one day 5 young college students came to listen to him preach. They had been planning this trip for a long time, and they were so looking forward to hearing Charles Spurgeon preach. And so they were standing in line. There was always a line that would form outside the entrance to the sanctuary for the people who were ready to come in and worship. This was pre-social distancing, and so people were packed together in that line. They were waiting for the doors to open. And so while these college students are standing in line, an older gentleman comes out and he welcomes them and he says, hey, would you guys like a tour of the church? Would you like to see the heating plant? And these guys, it's July. So it's pretty hot, and these guys are not wanting to go see a boiler room in the church. I mean, that's the last place they would want to go. But they didn't want to offend this gentleman, and so they agreed to go on the tour of the church and to go see the heating plant. And so this man took them down a flight of stairs, and they came to a door. And he said, on the other side of this door is our heating plant. I can't wait for you to see it. And they couldn't imagine what they were about to witness, but he opened the door. And inside that room were 700 people on their knees, fervently praying for all that was about to happen in the worship services of that church. And this man said to these college students, "This is our heating plant." And then he said, "Oh, by the way, I want to tell you, I'm Charles Haddon Spurgeon." So he took them on a personal tour to show them where the power came from in that church. And I believe that God is wanting to grow up a similar group of people who are Sunday morning prayers. He wants to create a Christ UMC heating plant of sorts. People who will gather together on Sunday mornings before our worship services begin to pray for the people who are in the worship services, to pray that lives will be transformed by Jesus Christ and by all that takes place in the worship. And not just to pray before, but to pray during. Because I believe that life-changing, faith-shaping encounters will happen as a result of that kind of power-giving prayer. I also believe that God desires that we establish a weekly prayer meeting here at this church. I know we've tried this at times, and we've had varying degrees of success, but I believe this is a vision that God gave me a long time ago that He has not let up. I believe that God desires us to have a midweek prayer service where we gather together to pray for one another and with one another, to pray for our community, to just glorify God through our praying together and to see what God might do. Spurgeon also said this to some of his fellow pastors. He said, "Brethren, we shall never see much change for the better in our churches in general till the prayer meeting occupies a higher place in the esteem of Christians." One of the most dynamic congregations in our country is the Brooklyn Tabernacle. And Jim Cymbala, the pastor of that church, attributes that church's effectiveness to their Tuesday evening prayer service. Before the COVID-19 pandemic set in, they would regularly have thousands of people that would gather every Tuesday night for prayer in Brooklyn. He says, this is why our church is what it is today. Not because of our great choir, but because of our great prayers. I believe God is wanting to grow that up. I believe God is wanting our congregation over the months and years to come to be grounded in power-giving prayer. The second focus point that God has given me is that He is leading us to be a church that engages in mission work that intentionally reaches the unreached for Christ. He's desiring that we become a church that actively engages in mission work, that intentionally reaches the unreached for Christ. We do a lot of good in this community. We do a lot of mission work in this community. But our church, and most churches for that matter, a lot of times will so engage in the doing of mission work that we overlook the importance of personal faith sharing. We help the hurts, but we don't touch the soul. And so I believe that God is calling us to actively engage in mission work to reach the unreached for Christ. And I believe He's calling us to do that in two different locations. One is a global reach. And I believe God is calling us to deepen our engagement in missional ministry to those who live in the 1040 window. Now you may wonder, what's the 1040 window? You can Google it after church, but the 1040 window, just in summation, the 1040 window is a portion of our globe on the eastern part of our globe, the eastern hemisphere, and a portion of the western hemisphere between the 10-degree latitude and 40 degrees latitude above the equator. And within the 10-degree latitude and the 40-degree latitude, which is called the 1040 window, within that 1040 window, over 2/3 of the world's population currently resides. And within that 1040 window is assembled the greatest number of people who are unreached by the gospel on the planet. I've been to one location within the 1040 window during the course of my ministry. I spent 2 weeks in Nepal. And during my time there, I saw first generation Christianity. It was amazing to see what the Lord was doing in that place. And I believe that God is calling us to reach into that portion of our world, to reach the unreached for Christ. But I also believe that the 1040 window doesn't just exist on the other side of the globe. I believe that there is a 1040 window that exists in your neighborhood. You see, I think we have this false notion that in order to reach the unreached for Christ, we have to get on a plane and go to the other side of the planet. The reality is, I think, that there are a significant number of unreached people for Christ who live on the other side of our neighborhoods. And we need to intentionally engage in reaching those unreached populations for Christ. And it takes effort. It takes time. It takes heart. It takes a willingness to get dirty, because it can be messy work. And especially in a culture that seems to be suppressing the Christian witness so heavily, it takes courage. But I believe God is calling us to be a courageous people who are unashamed of the gospel and who see ourselves as Jesus called the disciples to see themselves in Acts 1:8, when He said, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the world." Those uttermost parts of the world are in that 1040 window on the other side of the planet, and in that 1040 window that exists on the other side of your neighborhood. Or maybe just the other side of your street. We've got to be a people who actively engage in reaching the unreached for Christ, globally and locally. A student once asked Spurgeon, I didn't feast on Charles Spurgeon stuff this week. This is my last Spurgeon quote, but I've been heavily impacted by him this week. A student once asked Spurgeon if the heathen who had never heard the gospel would be saved. And they were talking, obviously, about the people who live on, in those unreached places of the planet. And they were asking, that person who lives on that remote island, And the person asked him if the heathen who had never heard the gospel would be saved. Spurgeon responded like this. He said, "My greater question is whether we who have heard the gospel and failed to give it to those who have not heard it can be saved." How seriously do you take what Jesus has done in your life? Do you take it seriously enough to be willing to share it with someone who hasn't heard it? Well, I want to tell you today that someone doesn't have to exist on the other side of the globe. That someone lives near where you live. And God has strategically placed you to be that light that pushes back the darkness. And I also believe that we've got to recognize that there are a lot of front doors that we have in our church for people who are unreached to come to know Christ, to be reached by Him. One of those front doors in our church is our Mending Hearts Grief Center. This is a ministry that actively engages people in our community who are hurting, who are grieving, with a wonderful, life-shaping, heart-transforming ministry of presence, of love, of counseling, of sharing. And there are occasions when people who come to participate in our Mending Hearts Grief Center are a part of that unreached people who live in that 1040 window in your neighborhood. And they come walking into this church because they need this ministry that we provide through the Mending Hearts. And that becomes a front door of the faith to that person. We need to do everything that we can to open as many of those front doors as we can. And as we seek to engage in active ministry to reach the unreached, God will show us more and more open front doors that we need to invite people to walk through. The third focus point that God has given me for our church is that God is leading us to become a church of expanding community. Last week I talked about our church being a church that is grounded in life-changing community. I believe that God is leading us to become a church of expanding community. And the problem that this focus point addresses is the problem of isolation. If there's a word that describes people in our American culture today, and even in our local community, that describes our people probably more accurately than any other word, it's the word isolated. We have never been more isolated from one another than we are today. And one of the reasons for that isolation is devices like this. Because they make us think we're connected when the reality is that we're not. These do more to divide than they do to connect. Trust me. And so I believe that God is calling us as a church to speak into that pandemic of isolation and expand community to reach the people who are trapped in isolation. And quite frankly, there are many people who are experiencing not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but a pandemic of isolation because they've been in their house for way too long. And the interactions they have are very, very limited. And quite frankly, most of us, see more eyeballs than we see faces during the course of our days. And so that sense of isolation is very heavy. And God is leading us to expand community into those areas where isolation has been so strong. The Bible says in Hebrews 24 and 25 in verse 10, or chapter 10, says, "And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." God is desiring us to expand community. I am so encouraged by the number of small groups and Sunday school classes that have re-engaged on our campus and in homes, even during this pandemic, where people are coming back together and experiencing the power of community. I know that God desires that to just continue to grow. There will be a day, friends, when we will all feel safe enough to come back on campus. There will be a day. And I look forward to that day, and I know you do too. But God calls us, not just today, but as we move into the future, to continue to expand our ministry of community, to reach as many people as we can and help them to recognize the beauty of being in a group with another person and discover the spiritual growth that happens when we connect ourselves with other believers. There's another area that God is calling us to expand our community. And that is in the area of young adults and families within our church. God is desiring us to foster expansive community within that demographic in our church. And that's one of the reasons why we're creating the children's space that we're creating in our next campus renovation plan, because we want to be able to provide a high quality space for our kids to come where they're excited to go into that space. And it's also a space that promotes their spiritual growth, and they're connecting with one another. And I'm so excited about what the kids are going to experience when they come into that children's space that's going to be developed in our next campus renovation plan. It's going to be exciting to see. But it's not just about space. Jana and I have been talking about this often, that the Lord is calling our church to be a resource for marriages in our community. As I look around our community, as Jana and I have looked around our community, the resources that churches provide to help hurting marriages is very thin. And so God is calling our church to be that place that people can come to when they're experiencing brokenness in their marriages and pain in their marriages. And God is calling our church to be that place that they can come to find healing and restoration rather than divorce. I love that vision that He's placed before us. And He's already laid the groundwork for that kind of ministry to grow more and more rich over the weeks and months to come. I believe God is calling us to speak into this culture where there's so much complacency in relationships. And He's calling us to speak a word of life into marriages and a word of hope into relationships. God's also calling us as a leadership body to expand the number of young adults and family members in leadership within our church. It's why our Committee on Lay Leadership, our nominating committee, has been working in recent weeks so hard at trying to make sure that we have a strong number of young adults that are serving in positions of leadership. And I think you'll see that in the coming year as we unveil our list of leaders for 2021. I'm excited to see what God is going to do. The last way I believe God is calling us to expand community into the area of young adults and families is to just encourage engagement within the church. Just simply to encourage engagement within the church. You see, our culture today, our culture does not have a high esteem for church. In fact, there are a lot of young families today who really don't see that the church can provide them any more value than other organizations or other activities that they can participate in during the week. I mean, what's the church going to do for me, for my kid? I believe God has given us a life-changing message to share. And unfortunately, I've seen patterns over the last 5 to 10 years of disengagement from the church. So much so that I believe we have grown and are growing a generation of young people who have no interest at all in church. Friends, that's got to change. That's got to change. And it can change with us if we take seriously God's call to expand community into those areas that are either uninterested or unengaged. He's calling us to do that and to be that kind of church. And then focus point number 4 is that God is leading us to be a church that engages in vibrant worship. The problem this addresses is the problem of a church's limited reach into the community. Now, I want to speak to this. We do have a diversity of worship offerings on our campus, but God is calling us to have a greater diversity, a more pronounced diversity. Because if we were just to have a traditional worship service on Sunday morning and have the same style of worship, we would speak to the same kind of people and we would have a limited reach within our community. I believe God is calling us to do so much more there. In fact, the Bible says, Paul says in Romans 14:10, he says, one day we will all stand before the judgment seat of God, for it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. Every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall confess to God. That is going to happen someday. And it is our charge as a body of believers to share the message of the gospel as broadly as we can, so that as many people as possible can hear that message and come to that place where they are prepared and ready to bow the knee to Jesus as Lord and Savior over their lives. And if we shirk that responsibility, we're missing out on the joy that God is calling us to embrace as a body of believers called Christians. Brian Dirkson's worship song, Come Now Is the Time to Worship, in that song he incorporates some of Paul's words from Romans 14 into one of the verses. He says, one day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. But still the greatest treasure remains for those who gladly choose you now. When I think about worship, my hope and my prayer is that every time people gather for worship, that gathering for worship will result in a life-giving and a faith-deepening encounter with God. It's not about the songs you sing. It's not about the sermon that's preached. It's about a life-giving and faith-deepening encounter with the living God. And so it's up to us as a church to offer as many different expressions of worship that will reach the people that God is calling us to reach, because I believe that people speak different languages when it comes to worship. I'm not talking about Greek and Hebrew, but I'm talking about traditional and contemporary. Different expressions of worship. I'm speaking about that when I talk about different languages. And God has given us the capacity to offer several different languages of worship expression within our church. And I believe that God is charging us to be very clear about what those expressions are going to be. I believe He's calling us to offer 4 different expressions of worship during the week. He's calling us to offer a midweek expression of worship that's contemporary in nature, but reaches the people for whom weekend worship is difficult. Then on Sunday mornings, I believe God is calling us to offer a traditional expression of worship. Yes, we have by name a traditional worship service. I believe He's calling us to make that a more traditional expression of worship. You'll see what that looks like in weeks to come. I believe God is calling us to continue to offer excellent contemporary worship. And then I believe God is also calling us to offer a blended style of worship. Yes, we call this a blended style of worship, but He's calling us to more significantly blend this worship expression in a way that reaches as many people as could be reached by an 11 o'clock worship service. And so I believe God is calling us to offer 4 distinct expressions of worship, 4 distinct worship services in many different locations. Our next campus renovation plan is going to bring about a new worship space that's designed exclusively for contemporary worship. And that'll happen at 9:30, and we'll continue to have our 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock services in here. But I believe that God is calling us to offer 4 different expressions of worship in many different locations. 2 locations on campus, and then live stream services across the globe. This is what this is part of the new reality that COVID-19 has brought us. And that is that it used to be that our live stream services were really more just kind of an offering for people who weren't going to be able to be here on Sunday mornings. Now our live stream worship services are an additional congregation on Sunday mornings. And I believe that that's going to continue into the future. And so God is calling us to, when it comes to vibrant worship, to offer 4 distinct worship services in many different locations. And then the last focus point is that I believe that God is leading us to become a church that embraces new ways of being the church. He's leading us to become a church that embraces new ways of being the church. And the problem that this gets at is a problem that every organization and every church experiences over time. And that is the problem of complacency and getting stuck in the status quo. We've done it here. You've probably experienced it in your places of work and the organizations that you're a part of. It's very easy to get bound by complacency and stuck in doing the status quo. And I'm going to tell you that's a strong pull during this season that we're in right now. I mean, let's face it. How many of you have been longing for normal? You know, I mean, how many times have I heard somebody say, I'm just ready for it to get back to normal? I mean, how many of you said it? How many? Don't you look forward to the day that you can look at a whole face and not just a portion? Don't you look forward to a time when you can stand next to somebody and not have to worry that you're getting too close? Don't you look forward to a time when you can walk up to somebody and they don't put their hands in their pockets because they're afraid to shake your hand? Don't you look forward to the time when you have to ask permission to be able to just stand next to somebody or put your arm around them and give them a hug? I'm looking forward to that day. But I got to tell you, there are a lot of people who say, I'm so ready for it to get back to normal. But I'm going to tell you, I don't know that I'm ready for things to get back to normal as we knew it in February. There's a book that's recently been written called The Post-Quarantine Church. It's recently written by an author named Tom Rainer. And this is what he says about our desire to get back to normal. He says, during the peak of the pandemic, many church leaders and members could not wait until everyone could return to the way things used to be, resuming old programs and old methods and old activities. He said the biggest problem with the back to normal approach is that the world and post-quarantine world are not the same. And he concludes, churches cannot minister effectively using methods for a world that no longer exists. I think he's right. I said to our staff a few weeks ago that as we think about ministry and as we think about the doing of ministry, we can't just settle for being a better version of ourselves. I think we do that a lot in the church. We do that a lot in our own personal lives. We just settle ourselves with being a better version of ourselves. I believe that God is calling us and inviting us to consider a makeover. Not just being a better version of ourselves, but something new, something different, something God-shaped that is different from what we've just kind of improved upon from 1 week or 1 year to the next. Because our world has changed. I mean, when this COVID-19 thing is behind us, we're going to live in a both-and kind of world, not an either-or kind of world. I believe that's why God is calling us to be very intentional about offering 4 different expressions of worship in many different locations. But I also need to tell you that in-person worship will be the driver in churches for years to come. In-person worship will continue to be our driver and the driver in all churches. But I'm convinced that online expressions of worship will continue. That's going to be a reality that we deal with from this point forward. We're also addressing our structure. Our structure as a staff, and our structure for leadership within our church. As we look to the future, as we take this opportunity to take a step back and glance at who we are and who we're becoming, we're going to be making some changes with respect to how we're structured as a staff, how our clergy are deployed for ministry, how our staff engage in ministry. We're also going to be making changes likely in our leadership structure so that we can more effectively do the ministry that God is calling us to engage in the months and years to come. There's one other problem that this focus point addresses, and that is the problem of the unfilled need in our own backyard. There are many unfilled needs in our own backyard. I don't know what they all are. But I know the more we look for them, the more the Lord will reveal them to us. We need to strive to meet those unfilled needs in our own backyard. Not just make comfortable the people that come, but we need to strive to reach out and address the unfilled needs in our own backyard. It requires that we expand our programs and ministries that engage the heart and develop people to be passionate about knowing Jesus and making Him known. That's what I believe God is desiring to build up within our body of believers. He's desiring us to grow deeper in our body of believers people groups that are passionate about knowing Jesus and making him known. There's no other way that we'll be able to reach the unreached for Christ than by having a growing number of people who are passionate about knowing Jesus and making him known. I also believe God is desiring our church to be a safe harbor for people. A place where people who are hurting and hopeless to come and find healing and hope. A place where people whose marriages are struggling to come and find restoration and not end up in divorce. I believe God is calling our church to be a place where parents can bring their children who are so confused by the culture today, and God is raising our church to be a place where those children can come and find Jesus and find transformation. And my heart is that we'll have children that go through the ministries of this church and graduate from high school and know Jesus. And not just be able to say I was a church member, but know Jesus. That's one of the strengths of our ministry right now, and I look forward to seeing what God will do. The more we work at reaching the unreached for Christ. And then lastly, I think God is calling our church to be proactive rather than reactive as a countercultural movement that impacts our community and world. I think for a long time we've been reactive in our way of responding to what happens in our community and our world. I believe God is calling us to be a proactive countercultural movement that impacts our community and our world. That's one of the reasons why we preached that sermon series on religion and politics a month or so ago. So that we would be proactive rather than reactive as we talked about the issues that we're facing in the election. I believe God is calling us to do more proactive kinds of ministries and engage in more proactive efforts to reach the culture. So that we're not impacted by the culture, we're not shaped by the culture, but we shape the culture. That's who God is calling us to be. And I believe he's calling us to do it right here in the area surrounding our church. I've been reading a lot lately, and one of the things I've been reading is that there is a resurgence in the neighborhood church in our culture today. It's something that sort of went by the wayside. You know, there was all this talk about regional churches. There's a resurgence now of the neighborhood church in our culture today, a church that engages the people who live in the neighborhoods that surround the church. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about our next campus renovation project, because the gathering space that we're going to create, for example, that's going to connect this building to the annex building, is going to have many different spaces within it where people can just informally connect with one another and engage in community and in fellowship and in spiritual growth. Not formally necessarily, but there'll be a lot of space for that to happen in a casual atmosphere. We're going to have a playground that is going to be in the center of all of this, that I believe that parents will be able to bring their children to come and play on while they engage in face-to-face community rather than community through a screen. In other words, I believe God is leading our church to see our campus as a legitimate third place. I know for some of you who are students of history, that's a 90s term. But I see that coming back, that the church can be that third place. Home being first, work being second, church being the third place. A place where people can come and connect and engage with one another and with the Lord in ways that are spiritually nourishing and faith deepening. And then finally, because of the second worship space that we're going to be adding in this next campus renovation program, I believe Sunday mornings can be a place that don't have to end abruptly after the worship service so that we can clear out and make room for the next group of people that comes in. I'm excited about the possibility of just lingering after a worship service, lingering with the Lord or lingering with one another, experiencing community with one another and with the Lord. I believe God has great things in store for us in that regard. So I've said this before, I believe our best days are ahead of us, and I truly believe that now. And so I want to close with the scripture that I began with today, from Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 16. Paul said this, He said, work hard to show the results of your salvation, obeying God with deep reverence and fear. For God is working in you, giving you the desire and the power to do what pleases Him. Do everything without complaining and arguing so that no one can criticize you. Live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people, holding firmly to the word of life. Do you believe that we live in a world that's got a lot of crooked and perverse people? Do you believe that there's a darkness that's surrounding us? Do you believe that the Lord has done something in you that's shaped you and equipped you to be a light that shines in the darkness? Then may we be that light. May we, as a body of believers called Christ United Methodist Church, boldly step into the days and weeks and months and years to come, answering our calling as Christians and as a church to be the light of Jesus that pushes back the darkness everywhere we see it, through power-giving prayer and through missional work that intentionally reaches the unreached, and through expanding community and vibrant worship, and through being a church that never shies away from new ways of being the church. God said in the end of the book, He said, behold, I'm making all things new. He wants to do that with you, and He wants to do that with us. May we offer ourselves to Him in every way, to become the people and the church He desires us to be. Let's pray.